Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My clock says it's 3 o'clock, so I think we'll get started. I'd like to say good afternoon to all of you and thank you for joining our presentation today on mass casualty incident response. My name is Kevin Riley, and I'm with the Emergency Management Department at Stony Brook University Hospital. We're going to focus our panel discussion today on the Pulse Nightclub shooting, which took place in Orlando, Florida, in the early morning hours of June 12th, 2016. Excuse me. At that time, this was the largest active shooter event in U.S. history, and today it still ranks as our country's second largest mass shooting. We have an hour today to tell a story, really, that could take all day to describe. So we're going to focus just on a few of the most salient lessons learned from the incident, and we'll try to save a few minutes at the end for some questions and answers. For anyone who is unfamiliar with the specifics of the nightclub attack, a lone gunman entered the establishment just after 2 a.m. on June 12th, 2016, armed with an assault rifle and a 9mm handgun. He immediately opened fire on the 300 plus patrons, and he sadly killed 49 and wounded another 53. The challenges of that night went well beyond the staggering number of victims. Unlike most active shooter events, this attack developed into a barricaded subject event. Hostages were taken. Responders had to cope with the threat of improvised explosive devices. And so it took over 3 hours to finally neutralize the threat and rescue the hostages. The common denominator of all these attacks, of course, is the pall that they cast over our society. But I think there's often some silver linings, and there are always lessons to be learned. So we're going to take a look at some of these takeaways, and by doing so, I hope to pay tribute to the intrepid law enforcement response that night, as well as the heroic actions that were seen at Orlando Regional Medical Center. That said, we are extremely fortunate today to have with us Mr. Raul Rivas, an 18-year member of the Orlando SWAT team. Raul retired from the Orlando Police Department in 2019, but not before he received the Award of Valor for his actions and his involvement in the Pulse incident response. We also have Dr. Michael Cheatham, a board-certified surgeon with Orlando Health Medical Group Surgery. He is also the chairman of the Surgical Education Department at Orlando Health and the Chief Surgical Quality Officer for Orlando Regional Medical Center, which, by the way, was luckily enough just located blocks from the crisis site. So, welcome to the panel, and thank you again for being willing to share your experiences with us. So we're going to examine this event from both a personal and organizational vantage point. A successful response to any crisis often hinges on the first few minutes and on the first few actions taken by responders and by a receiving hospital. So I'd like to start our discussion today by exploring the psychology of response and the psychology of personal performance. And I'd like to do this by asking each of you what your thoughts and actions were when you were first made aware that a critical incident was unfolding and that you yourself were going to play a significant role. So to be more specific, how does one summon the personal fortitude, the confidence, and the wherewithal to quickly pull it all together, to go from 0 to 100 and to dig deep to perform at your very best? How do you personally find cohesion and filter out all the chaos? And I'll start with you, Mr. Rivas, if you don't mind.
First, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. So to answer the question, in my 18 years of being on SWAT, and I'm sure Doc's going to say something similar, we do a lot of training. And I do believe that training helps in some of that, and gain that confidence, that feeling that you just know you can come out successful. I think it's through the amount of training that we do, and I can jump into a whole lot of that. But I think that's the first thing that I would look at is um, the different ways that we've kind of seen this already in our, through our training. So our mind has been there already, in some sort of some way. So it makes it a little, and we know we can win because we've done something like this before in our training. So that's kind of how we would, how I would answer that question.
And so it takes, I guess, a deep personal commitment to training and to the noble mission that your SWAT team normally undertakes. So that's great. I appreciate your answer. And Dr. Cheatham, how do you find cohesion in the chaos, and how do you dig deep to perform at your very best in a crisis situation?
It's interesting to hear that Mr. Rivas and I have the exact same feeling. I would have said training. And the quote that you had on your first slide.
I wrote that down, Doc. I wrote it down. You're stealing it from me, Doc. I wrote it down.
But I'm going to go back to that slide because I was going to address this at the end. So maybe to frame this a little better, I'm going to have everyone read the quote in the upper right-hand corner. It's very funny you guys brought that up because I wanted to. At the end, I was going to close with asking each of you if that statement up there from Archilochus from 2,600 years ago, is it true or false? Was he a pessimist or was he a realist?
I think it is incredibly true. And, as we look back on that morning, so when I first got called, I wasn't told it was at Pulse. It was an hour and a half into our response when one of the OPD officers walked in, and one of my partners and I were taking care of patients, and he mentioned Pulse. And we're like, what about Pulse? Because it's 2,100 feet away from us. It's 3 blocks. And he said, well, that's where the shooting is. And we kind of looked at each other and we're like, oh, really? We had no idea up until that point. So, we were just running on our training and responding as we do every day. And I think one of the things that, at least from the medical side, that we can talk about today is that your preparation for an event like this is not really anything to do with medicine, right? I mean, you take care of the patients, the victims, in the exact same way that you do every single day for every patient that comes into your trauma center or hospital. You do have to do things a little bit differently in a mass casualty situation, and that you learn through training and practice.
But I might add that even despite a lot of the technical training people undergo, there still has to be some personal deep down ability to perform, because a person can receive a lot of training and then still not be successful in a difficult environment. So you both and your organizations were able to perform at an incredible level. So that's why I just wanted to ask each of you how it is that you personally prepared, less from a technical standpoint and more from just a, get inside your head and find that confidence to perform. Because I'm not sure if that's a learned trait or it's innate. I don't know if you have any insight on that, but I suppose it's both, maybe.
I think from the civilian side, I cannot speak to the law enforcement or from a military background, because I don't have either. From the civilian side, I don't know that you can ever prepare yourself for an event like this. And that is one of the things that we learned, was that going through an event like this has a lasting impact. We still have team members that are struggling with what they encountered that night. I don't think it's anything that you get over, and I'm not sure that you can ever prepare for that that side of the response.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sir.
I was just going to add, so as much of the training that we go through, I think this is what Doc is saying, is, I'm just going to add to it, but as much training as we try to go through, and we try to make it as realistic as possible, the real thing is the real thing. And it is just, it is so hard to just predict how one's going to react when it's the real thing.
Right.
Say that for us, when this happened and it started, it wasn't as real for me until I got there and unfortunately saw the carnage on the dance floor. That's when it became eerily real for me and kind of set me, I don't know, locked me in a little bit more, made me a little bit more aware of what was going on. But yeah, that's when it became real.
Interesting. And on a related note, I'll add that I interviewed Dr. Eric Goralnik up in Boston over the last summer about his response to the Boston Marathon bombing. And he said something very interesting to me, and maybe you could share your thoughts on this. In the life cycle of an event, of course, there's training, planning, preparing, and then there's the response, and then there's the recovery piece. And he pointed out something very, very interesting to me, because although the response piece is where lives are saved and where there's blood on the floor, and it's actually the smallest piece, because the planning and the training, exercising, that preparation phase takes months or years. The response really may only take an hour or several hours, and then the recovery piece, it could go on indefinitely for years. So I thought that was very interesting, the way he phrased that. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but we kind of lose sight of the fact that the response piece in terms of time is actually a very, very small piece of the life cycle of an event.
Go ahead, Doc. I'm sorry.
No, I would agree. There's another great quote that many of my partners and I like to use, and that is, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail.
Exactly.
And it's the planning that we did unbeknownst to us, in the months before Pulse, with OPD, with the local hospitals and EMS agencies and fire rescue. It was that planning. So 3 months before, our multi-county wide disaster drill was actually a active shooter event. And so 3 months before Pulse, we actually practiced how we would respond to Pulse. We didn't know it at the time, but that training paid off that morning. So you're absolutely right. It's everything that you do before an event like this is what ensures the success, if you will, of your response.
Right. It takes a great investment in preparing and training, for sure.
I'll tell you that you were bringing up kind of examples of time, but for law enforcement, it can be years of training for 10 seconds of response.
That's right.
It's years of dealing with it after. So yeah,
that's right. Yeah, you can train for months and years on the use of deadly force, but actually using it only takes a couple of seconds, and you have to make decisions very, very quickly. There has to be that muscle memory there. So on a related question, and then we'll move on to the next phase. But so, did you consider yourself lucky to participate in an event like this, or unlucky to participate? I'm curious what your thoughts were in the aftermath when you got, the next day. Were you reflecting back, thinking, boy, we all wish it didn't happen, but it did happen. Were you glad to be part of the response, or did you wish you had taken the day off from work and gone to play golf?
For me, I was glad to be there. I was a veteran of the team, being there at that point, 14 years already on the team when that happened. You always, as a leader on the team, you want to put yourself in danger before the guys that you're responsible for or younger than you. I tell you that, so I think I don't know if I'm lucky may not be the right word. I'm glad I was there though, but I do feel, and I dealt with some survivor's guilt. I mean, why didn't we die? And the way everything plays out when I present about this, I kind of explained that, but the way everything played out, the veterans that were back behind the wall at the last, when everything was kind of playing out at the end there, we all knew we were going to die that night. So, yeah, I don't know if lucky is the right word, but do feel
perhaps not.
But hope I'm conveying myself correctly. But yeah.
No, I think you are. I think we all know exactly what you mean. So, Dr. Cheatham, how did you feel the day after? Were you not, again, lucky may not be the right word, but did you feel fortunate to have been able to make such a big difference in such a critical event?
Yeah, I agree. I'm not sure lucky or unlucky is the right word. We had spent well over 20 years perfecting our, and it was far from perfect, but our response for a mass casualty event. We had planned, we had drilled. We had no idea that it would be something like the Pulse tragedy. I think I felt privileged to have been.
Privileged would be the right word, yeah.
And be able to help take care of patients. I mean, we were lucky in the sense that all 35 victims that arrived at the hospital with signs of life survived. We are very, very thankful for that. We were, at one point, we thought that there was an active shooter inside the building.
That's right.
And we had, people thought they heard shots fired in our emergency department. We barricaded ourselves into the trauma bay. And then, of course, we realized, well, but there are another 30 people outside the trauma bay that also need help. And so there was a question, nobody comes to work in a hospital and thinks that your life would be at risk. For a period of time that morning, we felt that our life was at risk, that we might have turned a corner and found the active shooter in the hospital. So in that regard, I guess I might feel lucky. The following day, it was still very surreal. Even a week later, it was surreal what we had gone through.
Sure.
So I think privileged is probably the best word that I would use, that we had planned, we had prepared, and that preparation had paid off in terms of the survival rate that we got.
Well, I'm gonna change my script for the next one. I'm gonna take out the word lucky and use the word privileged, and I'm gonna give you both credit for making that change. Well, thank you for those answers. And now I'd like to maybe switch over and touch upon organizational response and preparedness programs. I think we can all agree that there's a direct line between an organization's response to a critical incident and the investment that an organization makes in planning and training and exercising. Now, there's no way to plan for everything, and there's no way to replicate the intensity of that day in a classroom, and there's certainly no way to introduce perfect authenticity into an exercise environment. But yet both the Orlando Police Department and in particular the SWAT team and Orlando Regional Medical Center really rose to the occasion. So from an organizational perspective, could you just both give a brief synopsis of your organization's response so we could kind of walk through the sequence of events, and then maybe share a few thoughts on how your organization's planning process and training programs contributed to a successful hospital setting and then so many lives being saved in the hospital. What were your organization's biggest takeaways, I guess? And Mr. Rivas, I'll start with you.
Okay. So Pulse Nightclub, of course, patrons in there dance and have a good time. officers outside working what we call off duty. The Mr. Mateen comes in and scopes it out. I'm not sure if people know that he actually went in, kind of looked around, and came back out, got his firearms, and then went back in and began shooting. At that time, the industry standard, the law enforcement training, so he goes in through the front door there and kind of makes his way to the main dance floor and starts shooting. At that time, the industry standard, law enforcement standard, was to wait for a couple other backup units and then go in as a team and search for the wherever the perpetrator is. So that's what Adam was doing. So when he gets a couple guys there, he kind of pushes through the patio. So in the bottom picture there, you see the patio at the very bottom there. So he kind of pushes through there. That drives Mr. Mateen to the back of the club. When he gets to the back, you'll see where it says at the top of the picture you got up there, he's got a north and a south bathroom. So he goes down that hallway into one of the bathrooms. But now I don't want to skip by. Before entry was made by any officer, Mr. Mateen was kind of going from that main dance floor up to the top stage, down along this north and south bathrooms, then back through a little entryway there, back towards the front, and back to the main dance. So he's kind of doing big circles within the club there as he was shooting people. But he ends up in the north and down that hallway to the north and south restroom there. He goes back there, and the shooting it stops for the most part. And I say for the most part, it gets quiet. Guys are making entry, or officers are making entry. A couple more shots were fired, bringing the officers back there towards the north and south restroom, and then it gets quiet. It is now, there's no more shots fired for about 3 hours. SWAT gets called out. I arrive on the scene, like I told you, and we all kind of taking in the carnage that he left behind there, and we know he's somewhere in that back of the club there. In the midst of us now, and so there's contact being made with him and our communications and crisis negotiators. So it goes from an active shooter to a barricaded gunman hostage situation. So that slowed us down from pushing the action, if you will. He introduces that he has bombs, and we get intel that there may be bombs that he has in the bathroom with him, and maybe he's putting them on some people. And we're just trying to save everybody we can all throughout the club, that we can, any rooms that he is not in, trying to get them out. At one point, we decided to kind of make entry through we decided to make entry through the back and try to save people in the bathroom that he is not in, he's now in the north bathroom. We know that. So we're making entry into the south bathroom to try to get people out. We blow a hole, hole's a little bit off. So we didn't end up being where we wanted it to be, but kind of gave us a hole. We could see now we could see the door to the north bathroom. Made the right hole, got people out the south bathroom. At one point, he comes out shooting at us, and we shot at him. And that's kind of how that ended right there. I forgot the second part of the question. I'm sorry, that was a long synopsis. I was trying to go fast as I could.
Well, I just was asking about maybe your organization's planning process and training programs that led to this very successful response. It was a protracted response due to the circumstances, but
right. So
clearly you declared success at the end of the mission. So
absolutely. So the only thing I'll add to that is that up to that point, we had planned on active shooters. Again, we planned on having a 3 to 4 man team to go in the active shooter situation, and for lack of a better word, to go hunt the person that's shooting people. And so when Adam got that 3-4 man team, he actually went through where it says gate on the right side of the diagram there for the club. He goes through there, and that's what kind of pushes Mr. Mateen back to the back of the club there. But again, the shots stop. And then we got other people kind of coming in different entry points. So, and again, the shot stops. So our tactics kind of change and how we go to the hunt. We start slowing down the hunt real good. And nobody knew the layout of the club. So it was successful in that we pushed them where we pushed them, and it stopped the active shooter part.
Exactly right.
Yeah, so that was successful. So
at that point, you can't, because he's barricaded now with hostages. You can't push the fight to him any longer. You have to slow down and back off. Am I right?
Absolutely. And when there's communication also made, we always are trying to get the situation resolved without further bloodshed. So if we can, if there was a way to talk him out, that's going to be the first thing we're going to do. So, yeah.
So he starts shooting at 2:02 a.m. I know there were officers on scene very, very quickly. It was patrol that took the initial response. How long into the incident was it before SWAT actually showed up and he had moved into the bathroom to barricade?
We got there at I think it was 2:35, 2:36. When we started showing up. So we're about 30
a half hour into the scene.
Yeah.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. Your team did a great job, and I know one of your officers took a round in the helmet during the finale there, but luckily he survived, and we'll have a picture to show of him later. And you and your team did just an amazing job, and society owes you a debt of gratitude for that.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Cheatham, maybe you could just take a few minutes, kind of walk us through the sequence of events that unfolded at the hospital, in the emergency departments, and then getting the criticals into the operating room. Maybe just talk about your MCI plan and training programs that proved to be the ingredients for success for your organization.
Yeah, and so this may be an opportunity to go through that timeline. So this is the timeline of what happened. We've already spoken a little bit about when he first arrived. Obviously at Pulse. Pulse is 2,100 feet away from us. It's 3 blocks away. I drive by it to and from work every day. We could hear the shots. Very clearly. We could hear the breaching charges when the holes were blown in the back wall of the club. The first indication that we got was a call from MedCom that basically said that there was a mass casualty incident with 20 victims coming. One of my partners was actually in-house that night in the trauma bay, and he called me up on the phone because I myself and one other partner are the 2 closest trauma surgeons to the hospital based on where we live. And it was a very curt phone call. He basically said, I have 20 gunshot wound victims coming. I need you now. And that was the extent of it. There weren't the usual apologies. Hey, sorry to wake you up. It was, I have 20 gunshot wound victims. I need you now.
Right.
And so I immediately came in. We got the first victim a little bit after 2:10. Because it was so close, our initial victims actually walked to the hospital or were carried to the hospital. Our emergency department is the closest part of the hospital to the nightclub. We immediately called in all of our trauma surgeons. The pediatric trauma surgeon from our pediatric level 1 trauma center across the street, he got the page, called up and said, wait a minute, you guys don't do drills at 2:00 in the morning. What's going on? He came over. And so we very rapidly opened operating rooms. Of course, we run 2 rooms around the clock. We rapidly opened 4 rooms, then 6 rooms, then 8 rooms. And the first wave of victims, as you can see, there was 38. We had people being carried in There was one police officer who had a pickup truck. He was filling the back of his pickup truck with victims, driving
Ordinary.
up, dropping them off, and then turning around and going back for more because it was still a hot zone. Fire rescue couldn't get in there yet. And so actually the majority of our victims were brought to us either by ground, literally, or by private vehicle, by police.
Like Las Vegas.
Very similar, very similar. We ended up having almost 500 team members that came in that morning to help us with that. There were obviously, because we were on lockdown, that presented problems with getting our team members in. And so we had to communicate with them to not try and come in through the emergency department because everything, the whole south part of Orlando was shut down. Roadblocks at every intersection. You couldn't get to the hospital in the normal ways. And then of course we had the code silver, where in our emergency department where we thought that there was an active shooter. We can go to the next slide.
Let's see here.
So at this point in time, we have multiple operating rooms running, vascular surgeons coming in, orthopedic surgeons coming in. We would take patients pretty much directly from the emergency room straight up to the operating room, and our trauma surgeons actually stayed in the room, and we would bring patients to them. And then as they would finish, we would take the patient out, and literally they would walk into another room so that they could immediately start operating again. So we were able to get people into the operating room very quickly, get rooms turned over quickly, get a lot of victims operated on very expeditiously. 5 a.m. is Mr. Rivas has already talked about, the SWAT team breached the back of the club. And we were told, okay, you've got a second wave of victims coming. That turned out to be 11 victims, including the one SWAT officer who was shot in the helmet, and thank goodness for Kevlar. We then were told, you have another 40 victims coming. So we were told that there was a third wave. The advantage of these waves, if you will, you heard about this period of time where there were not shots being fired and with the negotiations going on. That time actually allowed us to restock, re-equip the emergency department and the operating room, and be prepared for the next wave of victims. But the third wave unfortunately never materialized. Those were the unfortunate patients, victims that died in the club. And so as the dust settled and fire rescue was able to get into the club, they realized that the majority of those victims had not survived, and so the third wave never materialized. The morning, I think we could go on to the next slide. The morning basically was now devoted to things that you don't plan for in your typical mass casualty drill. It was dealing with the families. It was dealing with the media. It was dealing with local government. And this went all the way up to the White House. And so those are the types of things that you don't plan for. We typically, in these drills, we talk about how we're going to take care of the victims, but we don't think honestly about what is important, or also important, and that is how are you going to deal? We had 500 family members and friends congregated outside of the hospital, all wanting to know, is my loved one alive? Are they dead? Probably the worst time was the 30, 45 minutes that we spent that afternoon reading off the names of the victims that we had in the hospital. And then
Very tough.
And family members coming up to us and saying, where's the other list? You didn't read off my son's name, my daughter's name. There's got to be another list.
Very powerful.
That was probably the hardest part of the whole day.
Got it. So you had, you said you had about 500 people responding. Those were all hospital staff members, or were they from other hospitals? Did you have a sufficient pool of manpower?
We did. We did. We had about 500 team members that came in that morning to help us. Nurses, blood bank personnel, laboratory personnel, surgeons volunteering to come in. About 9:30 that morning, as we're still in incident command, we started getting phone calls from team members, physicians who woke up and saw the news and immediately offered to come in and help. We had surgeons offering to fly in from as far away as New York to help us. But the reality is by 7:30 in the morning, the event was largely over. All the patients had been taken care of. They were in the hospital, in the ICU. And at that point in time, we actually didn't need any help, but now we had to shift gears and focus on family.
So, Doctor, when you and your team hear that these victims are coming and they're coming within minutes, in fact, I think some of them walked to the hospital, did the emergency department and the surgical teams, just in terms of manpower management, do you break up into teams, triage teams, treatment teams? Do you divide the emergency department geographically into different areas of responsibility? I'm just curious from a manpower management standpoint.
Sure. So basically, we do, like most trauma centers, we do triage patients at the door and break them up into red, yellow, green, or black. And that is done by our emergency department physicians. And so based upon how they appeared as they presented, they were sent to different areas within the emergency department. We had teams from our trauma surgeons that were stationed in those areas. We relied heavily on our residents who really were a huge help that morning. And as we identified who needed to go to the operating room, we obviously moved them through as quickly as we could because we knew that there were additional victims coming. And so we typically followed the traditional red, yellow, green approach. We didn't use triage tags. There was no time for that.
Right. Did you have the bed space? Did you have to free up beds?
So, it was very interesting. We were able to very rapidly clear the emergency department. We had practiced this in previous drills and had experienced it in real time with some large tornadoes and hurricane events that we've had where we had heard there would be mass casualties. So we found that we can clear the emergency room out very quickly. And then we were actually we told our hospitalists actually to go and move as many people out of the hospital as they could. So many patients got discharged from the hospital at 7, 8 o'clock that morning to make bed space because we didn't know exactly how many victims we would have.
And in terms of victims, the critical victims, you said you got them to the operating room as quickly as you can, of course. I'm just curious, how long does a critical patient, let's say with a gunshot wound to the chest and maybe some unstable vital signs, how much time are they going to spend in the emergency department before they're turned over to a surgical team?
Well, so our surgeons respond as most level 1 trauma centers would. So our surgeons were right there as they came in, working side by side with the emergency room physicians. We would move them quickly to the operating room. Operations were abbreviated in some cases using damage control techniques because we didn't know, again, how many victims we would have. The following day, we took a lot of people back to the operating room to do completion laparotomies and the like that, had we only had 1 victim, 2 victims, we probably would have done more during the initial operation. but we were told that there were literally dozens of more victims coming. And so we practiced, damage control procedures.
It's almost like a battlefield response. I'm wondering, do you automatically revert to alternate standards of care, or do you have enough time to play it by the book?
We were able to play it by the book. Everything basically moves at a much faster pace than it normally would. We did not have to devolve into sufficient care. We were able to maintain the standard of care. We just worked very, very quickly.
So, Mr. Rivas, before the patients got to the hospital, of course, they had to be extracted from the club, and I don't recall how many patients were still in need of rapid casualty evac, but I imagine the law enforcement response was both to deal with the threat, but also to evacuate the patients. Was that a big piece of the pie? Was that something that your teams had to take on, getting the victims physically out?
Yeah, I tell you, Doc brought up the incident command. So in the first moments of this thing, we have what's called a signal 43. So that the dispatch hears that, they send that out to anybody who's listening, Central Florida. So whether you're wearing a brown uniform, blue uniform, green uniform, you're showing up. All right. So what of course happens in any situation, but in this, shooting starts, good people start running away, saving their lives, and that's we know that that's good, right? So they run away. All these red and blue lights show up. And those same people that just ran away are now running back to the red and blue lights to tell the police, hey, there's somebody shooting in there, all right? And that's good too, but it makes for more chaos in that small area. So so people forget about that part of it. It's not just the part about going to get the guy, but it's everything that's going on. Again, we got victims, we have witnesses that are all, and this is all happening in a matter of minutes, right now.
Right.
So when all these different agencies, all these different patrol units and officers and deputies and troopers all show up, we've all kind of trained for it at some point or another, and having a mass casualty event like that. So the first few people that get there, their job's to go hunt and to go find the bad guy. The next few people, maybe they're hunting, but by the third wave, you're kind of starting to triage stuff, and that's where they right across the street was the Einstein Bagels, and that became the triage area. So they were grabbing victims or pointing victims and witnesses back behind that Einstein Bagels, and that's kind of where they were triaging people, getting them over there, and making a decision whether to tell them to go to the hospital. And they were jumping in the back of that pickup truck and going to the hospital, like Doc said. That's where all that stuff was kind of happening. I've got pictures of deputies, officers, troopers, all different uniforms, all of them getting to work at the same time, triaging people from the club there that need to go to the hospital. Amazing how that was going on. There's one more point I wanted to bring up, but I can't remember now. But yeah, I mean, as far as everybody working together and getting the things done, it was amazing. There was no, and of course, incident command gets going, and that command post gets put up there, and then that kind of starts taking effect. But in the moments before that, we've all trained for it in some, manner on what's all trained together. So we've had, and kudos to our partners here in Central Florida. And Doc, I'm sure you've been part of some of these things, but Disney World's trained with us, Universal's trained with us, and putting these big scenarios together and bringing in all the partners whether it be the fire departments, our infrastructure people, the wastewater, city management, bringing everybody together and say, hey, what would happen in this situation? How are we going to work together? And as far as law enforcement, it was just that. What would happen when you show up? And that's what everybody was doing. They all jumped in and started doing some work.
You got to look for work in a situation like that. And even if it's not a textbook response, you have to be ready, willing, and able to improvise, which it sounds like your team did. So patrol is handling in the first 30 minutes. They were obviously, their primary goal is to put the shooter down, to stop the killing. But I imagine they played a part in stopping the dying and rapid casualty evacuation. Maybe did any of the team apply tourniquets and how many? Do you know how many victims were evacuated from the site just by the law enforcement team?
I know. I think the pickup truck alone, I think they did 15. I think 15 times back, or 15 victims to the hospital. I don't know about the tourniquets. I tell you, there's a video that I have, which to me is just chilling, but it shows. So when Mr. Mateen is barricaded in one of the restrooms, where the stage is, the main dance floor and that stage right there near the dotted red line there, is video, body cam video of officers and deputies inside that dance floor. And again, all you have is a small wall separating where he was and where they are. And they are looking at these victims on the ground and just seeing that if they happen to catch somebody twitch, somebody breathing, and they were dragging that person out by their feet, maybe they can save one more person.
Exactly. It's about saving every life. Every second counts. Every drop of blood counts.
Yes, sir. So yeah, they were amazing and heroes, every one of them.
Mentioned Disney World, and if I'm right, I think the assailant's first target was going to be Disney World. Am I right?
Yes, sir. There's intel that shows that he went to Doc, what's it called now?
Disney Springs.
Disney Springs. I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm old, Doc. So okay. Disney Springs is like the entertainment district of Disney World, if you will. You can go bowling and the mall and the movies, and it's kind of this big entertainment area. So he went over that way, and intel says that he may have been scared away by the presence of deputies that were out there.
It's a lesson for all of us to learn that these terrorists, these active shooters, are willing to target just about anybody. And of course, they're going to look for target-rich environments, which the Pulse nightclub was, of course. I think there were over 300 people there. Is that right?
Yes, and I tell you what, this is the world according to Raul. I believe that his when he went to the club and he first goes in, I think that's what he was doing, trying to see if he's going to get the biggest bang for his buck.
And he was fully armed. I know he was carrying a lot of ammunition. Thank God. Right. It seems like a lot of these shooters carry a lot of ammunition because they want to kill as many people as possible. But thankfully, many of them don't seem to be too skilled with their firearm, and that's a good thing. Weapons jam, they overload magazines. They're not tactically trained, thank God. Otherwise, the death toll could be much, much higher.
Yes, sir.
So, Dr. Cheatham, back to the hospital for just a second. I understand you treated many of the victims, actually operated on them. But at some point, am I right in thinking that you went up to the hospital command center and then took on somewhat of a leadership role in the hospital command center?
Yeah, I'm largely an administrator nowadays. But you're right. I started responding to the event. There were two of us, Dr. Ibrahim and I were the first two to get there to help Chad Smith, who was our trauma surgeon on call that night. Immediately went to the operating room with one of the victims, came back down to the emergency department. By that point, additional trauma surgeons had arrived. And at that point, I switched hats because I'm normally part of incident command. So at that point, went down to help set up incident command, ran into our chief operating officer. And so the two of us got incident command up and running. And from that point on, from probably about 3:30 or so in the morning, I switched hats and was an administrator, helping to make sure that we had everything that we needed for our teams, bringing in additional supplies from our other sister hospitals. And then later in the morning, was asked to help with the press conferences that went on and explain to the media what had happened.
I think a lot of people don't understand that an efficiently run hospital command center and a very proficient hospital incident management team have just as much to do with a favorable outcome as do the doctors and nurses in the emergency room and in the operating rooms. It's a team effort, and every component of that is indispensable. Someone has to take control of the chaos and make sure there's enough staffing and enough equipment and all the logistics involved. And then, like you said, at some point you got to talk to the media. So,
yeah, I think one of the things that we learned from all this, we have an extremely low threshold to bring up incident command. We don't wait for a mass casualty event. I mean, if we get tight in beds, in a part of the hospital, we'll ramp up incident command. That allows you to practice.
Mm-hmm.
That means that everyone who is part of your incident command knows exactly what their job description is. They're not opening a binder and reading, a task list for the first time. And so one of the things that we really strongly encourage hospitals to do is use your incident command frequently so that you are used to it. And to your point, that way, when you actually need it, you're not basically learning how to do incident command at the same time that you're trying to manage an event.
it should be a reflex. It should be muscle memory.
Yeah.
And to that point, I'll quickly go into our last question, and then maybe we'll get some Q&A in there. Is that so? From an individual perspective, can you just identify maybe one or two things that you can point to that made you the most prepared in terms of training? Can you point to one type of training evolution that you reach back to first in order to accomplish the mission that night? Is there one type of training or one training evolution or one exercise event that you think is of the greatest benefit?
For us, so when he came out of the bathroom and was shooting, and seeing the muzzle flash, fortunately, we've done that type of training where somebody's shooting at us, watching and seeing muzzle flash. And this is one thing that they talk about, the whole what happens in your body and how it's because your mind has been there before your body can now perform, because it's not surprised by what's going on. I can remember going through my steps of how to aim and shoot.
Muscle memory. Yeah. So for you, you would say firearms proficiency for somebody, for law enforcement, for SWAT would be.
So not just efficiency. I would say the scenario-based training.
Scenario-based. Okay.
Yeah. So so you have to keep thinking about the impossible, the improbable. I believe you have to keep training that way and keep asking what if, and then present that to your people. At least in law enforcement, we got to keep and unfortunately, let's keep learning as these incidents happen. We have to learn from them. We have to, put
Absolutely.
that out there. I hope that when Pulse happened, everybody in the country and law enforcement found a way to kind of mimic that scenario, and let's work it, let's run it. We don't, and learn from it. So when it happens, I say when it happens in your area, you're ready as much as you can be.
And don't be complacent. Don't think it's never going to happen to you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's for sure. Dr. Cheatham, can you think of just one type of training or the best type of training, a specific example that gave you the muscle memory to perform at your best? Was it, an MCI drill or a hospital command center drill, or what one thing could you point to that made you ready?
I think you have to drill to fail.
Don't be afraid of failing, right?
And so historically, when people used to do hospital drills, they would say, well, we have 45 victims coming in, to our 6-bed emergency room. We'll go ahead and take care of them and intubate this and put a central line in here, put a chest tube in here. And then after an hour drill, it's like, yep, we've sent everybody up to the operating room and they've already made it to the floor, and they pat themselves on the back. And
let's go get some coffee.
We're ready.
Yeah.
The reality is, when you do these drills, you have to drill to fail. You have to keep pushing the system. You have to be real.
Excellent point.
And, you're out of supplies.
Excellent point.
Your power just went out.
Right.
You can't get all those additional staff in because the roads are blocked. You have to drill to fail so that you can really learn where the weaknesses in your system are.
Yeah, plan worst case and expect those cascading effects that are really going to ruin your day beyond what it is you have in front of you. There's always the unexpected.
That's what we call the what ifs, Doc, and that's you said it perfect. Just keep what ifing. What if this happens? So and just got to keep working that. And it's okay. And we have a saying that we're going to keep doing it till we can't get it wrong. So because I think a lot of people train, so you do it 10 times and you get it right that one time. Okay, we're good. No,
yeah.
Right.
We're going to do it till we can't get it wrong. So we don't train to a time, but we train to a standard.
Yeah, you have to become accustomed to the point at which you're going to fail. You have to know the envelope, know your limits, and then improve upon that. So, gentlemen, I'm being very mindful of the time here. I see we're getting close. So I'd like to see if we can just sneak in a couple of questions and answers. But I do just want to say that I have seen you both present, Mr. Rivas, I've seen you present in person. And Dr. Cheatham, I've watched some of your presentations on YouTube, and I just want to encourage our audience to watch these presentations because they are two of the absolute very best. I mean, there's a lot of pearls of wisdom in these presentations, and there's a lot of tools that we can all put in our tool bag thanks to these two gentlemen. So I commend you for your efforts that night, gentlemen, and I also commend you for being willing to be an evangelist for this kind of thing and to keep putting the word out and keep talking and keep sharing your experiences. There's no better training for anyone than to hear from the people that were there. So please allow me to pay you the great compliment of calling you both heroes.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely, richly deserved. And I'd like to just see if we have any questions here in the chat box. Look up, please forgive me for that. There's one for you, Dr. Cheatham. What did you instruct your staff to say or present to get through the multiple roadblocks? Am I reading that right?
That's a great question. So you have to have a way to communicate with your staff. What we did was we sent a mass communication out to all of our team, letting them know what was going on. We made sure that they knew that they weren't going to get in the hospital without their ID badge. And we told them to come in from the north. We told them that coming in from the south was not going to be possible. I normally come right up Orange Avenue past Pulse. That was completely blocked off. And so we got the word out to everyone that they needed to come from the north and then make sure that they had identification because the hospital was on lockdown.
Gotcha. But you were able to get the word out, it sounds like. I have a question from Nate. Were patients transferred to other hospitals, or were you able to treat the full surge patients?
So another very good question. As Mr. Rivas pointed out, at the time of the event, everyone's scattered. Many people left the scene. They wanted to get as far away as they could. It was sometimes only when they got home that they realized they were injured. And so we did have a small number of patients that were taken to, they presented themselves to other hospitals in the community. We also had about a dozen victims, kind of green level victims that were taken to another hospital here in town, Advent Health. And so they took care of those patients as well. But the vast majority came to ORMC simply because it was the closest hospital, and it was the only level 1 trauma center.
Okay. And I understand, I think we may have mentioned this before, but some people actually walk there, I guess, perhaps not the critical patients, but some of them walk there. But along those lines, in terms of getting patients to the hospital, it seems like there's a couple of questions here about the use of EMS. And this unfolded very, very quickly. And I think there was some challenges in setting up unified command and integrating all the response agencies. So, of course, law enforcement rightly resorted to using pickup trucks and whatever methods there were to get people to the hospital. My understanding is that 16 patients were taken by ambulance. So EMS certainly did play a presence. But given the exigent response, the immediate emergency, you just kind of had to load them up and go, kind of like Vegas, kind of like the Aurora, Colorado movie theater. You know, they use police cars. In Vegas, they use buses. So am I right in thinking most of the criticals got to the hospital relatively quickly by non-traditional means? Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah. So EMS did play a role, and I think I'm right in saying that ambulances transported 16 of the patients. And to many of our viewers, I would have liked to actually have gone into the specifics of the EMS participation in this. Unfortunately, it was only due to time constraints that we really couldn't explore the EMS angle too much. But yes, they did play a role. They did a good job. They did save lives. But I think most of the criticals were rapidly taken to the hospital by other means. I hope that answers the questions.
Yeah, I would add it was a hot zone, as Mr. Rivas can tell you far better than I could.
Right.
One difference that is in place now is that our fire rescue now has body armor that they can wear when they are put into a situation where they need to go into an area that still has not been secured.
And we see more and more nowadays that EMS is willing to go into a warm zone if they're properly trained and equipped. But I think with this particular instance, another complicating factor was the threat of IEDs.
Yes.
And no EMS agency, an EMS agency might consider sending a rescue task force into a warm zone, but when you have the potential for bomb blasts, it's very hard to define what the difference between a warm zone and a hot zone. So I think that probably played a factor in it too. Just an incredibly complex event from every angle. But the
I'll tell you
IED.
that. I'm sorry, Kevin. I was just
go right ahead, sir.
There's a question about, or not, a statement about training with the PD and entering in the diamond. Yeah, we had done that training at this point when the pulse happened. We had done that training with the fire department. We were kind of, I want to say, almost in the middle of it, or just kind of completing it as far as having them train with us and doing that. But it hadn't been implemented yet. It hadn't been, okay, go, and the armor hadn't been given yet, So we were there, we just weren't there yet.
Right. And a rescue task force in a traditional active shooter event is one thing, but this rapidly became a barricaded subject, and that's going to, in some sense, obviate the need for a rescue task force. I think, in my opinion, when you're talking about bomb blasts, IEDs, that just adds a level of complexity that I don't know if anyone's training to that level. So let's see if we have anything else. Based on lessons learned, did your hospital increase any particular medical supplies or equipment? Interesting question, because I was going to ask that too. Did Did you have enough chest tubes? Was there enough blood? Those kinds of things, ET tubes and so on and so forth.
So we have disaster carts that we set up years ago. They're color-coded that we take to the various parts of the hospital where we're going to triage those victims. Those carts contain additional chest tubes, Pleurovacs, chest tube trays, endotracheal tubes, all of that. Regardless, we still ran out of chest tube trays. And so we ended up having to pull chest tube trays over from our pediatric trauma center. In our current evolution, we have additional chest tubes, the things that we ran out of, but having those waves allowed us to restock in between. One word about blood. Our local blood provider, One Blood, was watching this unfold on the news. They called us up. It was the first phone call we got in instant command, basically telling us we've loaded 100 units of O-negative blood on a truck. It is on its way to you, and we will continue to send you blood throughout the morning. And they did. We transfused a little over 500 units of blood in the first 24 hours. So One Blood, that relationship with our blood provider was essential.
So there were some supply challenges which appeared to be remedied in fairly short order. So that's a good takeaway. Another question is, can you elaborate on communication with the known victims or those who were reported missing? Was there a hotline for persons? And that may have come perhaps the next day or two later. I don't think that would have been set up on the very same night, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, we went ahead and set up a hotline number early that morning at about 6 a.m. As family members were asking questions. We asked the family members to email us photos, even photos of tattoos, distinguishing marks, because many of the victims did not have any ID on them. It was still in the club. But having that type of a hotline was very crucial in helping us to identify all of the victims.
Sure. Okay. So we're a little over time, so I'm gonna try to sneak in one more question, and then I'm gonna tell our guests that if you have any questions that weren't answered, kindly email them to me, and I will do my very best to take even more time away from Dr. Cheatham and Mr. Rivas to see if they can answer your question at a later date. But if you didn't get your question answered, just let's still work on that. Send it to me, and I'll see what I can do. But the last question would be, how many victims, in your estimation, bled out before reaching the emergency room? And I think in some cases, these are sometimes preventable deaths because perhaps there were extremity wounds or where people bled out. And of course, those are treatable with tourniquets and other interventions. So do you have any feel for how many victims bled out before reaching definitive care? Maybe that's a tough question to ask. There may not be any data on that exactly.
There was an assessment by the District 9 medical examiner was that none of those who died had survivable injuries. The number of gunshot wounds, I forget the exact number, but on average of those that died, it was something like 6 gunshot wounds, as many as 13 gunshot wounds. They were deemed to be non-survivable. There have been some attempts by those that weren't involved in the event to try and postulate on that as to whether patients could have survived had they been seen earlier, but I don't think that data is accurate.
Okay. And I think in instances of civilian active shooter events, as opposed to the military where they wear body armor, in the civilian events, people aren't wearing body armor. So unfortunately, most of the penetrating traumas to the chest, abdomen, or head, and in which case a lot of those are not survivable, unfortunately. So, okay, I want to wrap it up at this point. Again, if you have any other questions, you can feel free to email them to me. I just want to say in closing that, again, I've seen presentations by both of these gentlemen, and I would highly, highly encourage anyone to attend one of Mr. Rivas's presentations that he gives, or go on YouTube. And there's one YouTube presentation in particular from you, Dr. Cheatham, that I have to say is, in my opinion, the best hospital emergency preparedness and response presentation that I have ever seen. So I would encourage people to take a look at that.
Kevin, if I just 1 second.
Sure.
When I do my presentations around the country, Doc, I sing your guys' praises. I always tell everybody, God forbid, if I'm in, whatever state I'm in, and somebody happens to walk in and shoot me, I want you to fly my butt to Orlando Regional, because they will keep you alive. That you guys worked miracles that night, and I sing your praises everywhere I go. And please spread the word that you guys were appreciated by us. So thank you.
Well, it's a team effort. The relationship that we developed ahead of time with OPD, with OFD, FBI, Secret Service, all of those relationships paid off. So the time to develop those relationships is now, and not in the midst of an event. I don't know what the best way to do this may be. We actually wrote a book on how to respond to a mass casualty event. The hospital did. It's got about 40 chapters. It includes chapters from administrators all the way down to housekeeping, nursing, physicians, respiratory therapy. I don't know what the best way to let your readers or your viewers know about that, but they're short chapters, but it's the kind of thing where if your administrator is wondering what incident command is all about, if your housekeepers are wondering how they're going to respond, because our housekeepers were the unsung angels that morning.
Everybody plays a role, that's for sure.
Everyone plays a role.
Yep.
So that is a resource that I would offer to your viewers.
Well, that's excellent. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So you are both extraordinary practitioners in your field, and you're very gracious with your time. I can't thank you enough for joining us today. And I hope there's discussions to be had in the future. Be safe out there. Keep doing what you're doing. And we all owe you a debt of gratitude.
Thank you so much for having us. I appreciate it.
Thank you very, very much.
And thank you to all who tuned in. I trust you all got a lot out of this, and there's more of these discussions to come with our webinar program in the future. So I wish all of you a great day, and be safe out there. Thank you.
Okay, guys. Bye-bye.